You're listening to the Stephen A. Smith Show podcast.
It is my honor and privilege to have my next guest on the line, somebody that I reach out to continuously to be educated about the things I do not know, which means I talk to him quite often, by the way. He is the great one himself, historian, professor emeritus at UC Berkeley, former consultant to the San Francisco 49ers. I think he might still be doing that. Lord knows what else he's doing. He's always active, a pillar within the African-American community and beyond. The one and only Dr. Harry Edwards is on the line with yours truly. Doctor, how are you, sir? How's everything?
Well, as usual, I'm doing better than I deserve, but I'm still on this side of the lawn, so I'm fine.
I got you. You heard the news come down about the NFL and what they've decided to do in terms of making sure that players who elected to kneel during the national anthem, it would not be allowed. If they did that, any team personnel or league personnel for that matter, not just the players, but obviously the players themselves, they would be fined. Subjected to additional penalties by individual teams as well. But they also had the choice to stay inside the locker room until the national anthem was played, and then they could come out thereafter. Your reaction when you heard that ruling come down?
Well, first of all, I've been around the NFL for 31 years. I've been a consultant with the 49ers for 31 years. I've also been a consultant with the NBA and worked with the Golden State Warriors for 10 years and have spoken to the team on a couple of occasions, even over the last year. Of all of the experiences that I've had, this is probably the dumbest move that I've ever seen a league make in terms of this type of issue. First of all, it's consistent with an extended, ongoing perception in American society that black people are not creditable witnesses to their own experiences or speakers to their own motives and intents. And so for the commissioner to stand up and impose on this situation a definition of targeted action that involves disrespect for the flag, the soldiers, and the anthem is an absolute unadulterated lie. I think Roger knew that when he said it. There's not a single athlete that I've talked to, and I've talked to most of the protesting athletes, including Michael Bennett, most certainly Eric Reed, and Colin Kaepernick. Not one athlete has ever said, I'm protesting the flag, the anthem, or against our soldiers. Mm-hmm. It has always been a protest in the name of justice. And what they're saying is that we're better than 348 black men, women, and children being shot down by police in this country since Kaepernick first sat down in protest of that level of injustice. Roger knows that, but yet he stood up there, mouthed the words of the extreme pathological right, and made this an issue of patriotism. That's the first issue. We are not creditable witnesses to our own experiences, motives, and intents as far as American society is concerned. The second thing is that they've taken an issue that was targeted outside of the arena and made it a football issue. This was about injustice in society. They have now made it an issue between owners and players, between coaches and players, and even between players themselves when some players want to take the field and stand for the anthem and others want to stay in the locker room. They've also put a spotlight, bigger than ever, on the protesters because what is going to happen is everybody's going to be waiting for those athletes who choose not to come to the field to run out onto the field. It's going to be like Hail to the Chief being played before the president enters the congressional chamber during the State of the Union address. That's what happened with Chris Jackson, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, when he didn't stand for the national anthem as an NBA player. They put him in a locker room, and after about 4 games, there was only one thing that the anthem had any meaning in terms of, and that was just before Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf ran onto the court. They put a bigger spotlight on the protest than ever before. So this whole thing is a disaster. It's coming apart. People are coming out now and saying there was no official vote. It was much less a unanimous vote.
It was informal. There were hands that were raised. At least two owners abstained. Jed York for San Francisco and obviously Mark Davis for the Oakland Raiders. They abstained, and everything was an informal vote. It was no official vote, sir. No official vote. Yeah, there was no official vote. There's no official definition of what constitutes a protest. So if a player raises the fist, is that player's team going to be fined? If a player simply walks out during the national anthem, is that a protest? Is that player going to be fined? Suppose players lock arms. Are those players going to be fined? And what about a groundskeeper who's trying to cover up a mole hole before the kickoff, which comes immediately after the anthem? If he's down on a knee trying to cover up a mole hole, is that player going to be fined? And what about the 65 or 70 people who belong to franchise, who are affiliated with the franchise, who are taking care of various business around the stadium during the course of the playing of the national anthem? Who's keeping an eye on them? Who even knows who they are on every team? So this thing is a fiasco. The notion that these players are protesting the national anthem or protesting the flag or demonstrating against the soldiers is a bald-faced, unadulterated lie. We all know that's a bold-faced lie. We all know that's a bold-faced lie. But you specifically, Dr. Harry Edwards, you specifically mentioned the commissioner. I'm thinking about the 30 to 32 owners, or 32 owners to be specific, that he has to answer to, that used him as a conduit to speak on their behalf. This is the conclusion that they come to. You mentioned the commissioner. The Players Association is in an uproar. DeMaurice Smith and those guys have spoken out against it, but they had a problem because they thought they were guaranteed by Roger that there were no changes that would be made, but essentially it was left the impression he didn't want to do this. His hand was forced by the owners. To that, you say what? Well, I think that there's no question. Look, Roger's a decent guy. I know him. I talk to him. We exchange phone calls all the time. I know him very well. He's an eminently decent guy. He's in a situation where he has to herd cats and skunks, and every now and then he gets sprayed, and when he comes before the microphone, the stench is on him. He knows that these athletes are not protesting the flag, the soldiers, and the anthem, but he stood there and said that, mouthing word for word what the pathological liar in the Oval Office has said. So at the end of the day, he's in a tough situation, but that's why they pay him $44 million a year. He has to figure a way where he can do what's in the best interest of the game. He had the option to do nothing. The whole protest movement was fading. And what this move did was to put it on life support, hang an adrenaline drip into it, and by the time the season starts, you're going to have, if they're lucky, chaos. If not, you're going to have a uniform rebellion against this by players across the league, and the fines will be meaningless because they will have created a spotlight for protest. We're talking to the great Dr. Harry Edwards right here with Stephen A. on ESPN Radio. Dr. Edwards, you and I speak periodically, and I'm always enlightened, and I always appreciate the counsel and the education you provide me. I'll play devil's advocate, however, in this particular sequence. When we're talking about the National Football League, what do you say to the argument that if you're an NFL owner, the protest were not necessarily against you? It was a protest addressing the ails of our society right now, particularly as it pertains to minority communities and specifically African-American communities throughout the United States of America. And as a result of that, because it wasn't the problem of the National Football League, why should the National Football League stand idly by and do nothing while their bottom line is compromised because of protests that were not even aimed at them? What does Dr. Harry Edwards and others say to that? Put it in a collective bargaining agreement. What do you mean, sir? What do you mean, sir? And at a minimum, don't take a protest that was focused beyond the arena and make it a football issue, which is what they've done. Put it in a collective bargaining agreement. Get with the Players Association. Put what in a collective bargaining agreement? Just to be specific, I don't understand. That you cannot reference anything, stage any type of response or protest or in support of anything that is not directly an aspect of the mission and so forth of the football organization. Put it in a collective bargaining agreement. Put it in a collective, but don't go through and select the protest
which is, and say you can't do this, and this disqualifies you and constitutes a finable offense of protesting the summary execution in some instances of black men, women, and children in the black community, and in other communities of this kind of thing happening in other communities of color. We can't stand for that, but at the same time, you can stand for rapists to be brought back into the game. They don't take a poll to see if they want to bring somebody back into the game who's been beaten on a woman. Right. They don't take a poll to see if somebody who's been murdering mutts should be brought back into the game. They don't take a poll to see if even owners who are under various clouds involving sexual misconduct should be
Richardson,
kept as owners.
Former owner of the Carolina Panthers, Jimmy Richardson, being the latest example of that.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, at least at a minimum, be consistent. If you have a strong league-wide feeling about protest, about anything that is references outside activities, actions, injustice, and so forth being represented on the field on game day, then put it in a collective bargaining agreement. Get with the players, but don't come out of the blue in response to some political disposition going down in Washington, D.C., and use the exact same words and say, this is an insult to the anthem, the flag, and the soldiers, and we have to put an end to it.
Dr. Harry Edwards, what disgusts you more? Listen to my multiple choice here. I want to know what's at the top of your list of what disgusts you more. Is it the reality that the President of the United States hijacked the issue of the protests addressing racial oppression, racial inequality, police brutality, etc., and turned it into an issue of patriotism? Is it the cowardice or whatever other word you want to come up with as it pertains to the owners and the commissioners and the commissioner himself in addressing this issue? Or is it the fact that these owners and the commissioner never went to the players to actually do what you just suggested, discuss with them and implement it into the collective bargaining agreement? Of those three examples that I gave you, what disgusts you most?
Well, I'm not surprised at anything that happens coming out of the Oval Office, and I'm not surprised about the level of, for lack of a better word, stupidity of some of the owners. What I do expect is a more intelligent approach and response to the situation in the interest of the game. And so I think the thing that I have the greatest difficulty with is the fact that there would not be an orchestrated effort from the commissioner's office to get with the Players Association, especially since the movement was fading anyway, and say, hey, let's put something together that allows us to intelligently manage this, because there are pressures to reinforce, side with, back, validate some political interests that have nothing to do with the task at hand for us. That is the minimum that I would have expected coming out of New York, but that didn't happen. The other thing that I would say is this: is that the fans, the people have to be smarter. I'm shocked and surprised, for example, at the disposition of people toward the, quote, pardoning of Jack Johnson, another cynical, self-serving, degenerate act. Right. Jack, you don't pardon the victim. You pardon the criminal. You apologize profusely to the victim and provide reparations where it is practical. So I could see a president apologizing profusely
to Jack Johnson for him being incarcerated for 10 months. You know, basically for an interracial consensual interracial relationship.
The Justice Department and the police agencies that collaborated with the Justice Department to hound this man for 9 years all the way to Europe and then put him in jail for 10 months in 2020, those are the criminals. But when you pardon the victim, you create a situation, one, which is inappropriate, but two, you quiet all discussion of the real criminal and the crime perpetrated in many instances, which are still going on today, black people being hounded and incarcerated and in prison and so forth, who are innocent. So at the end of the day, we have to be smarter. If we accept this thing, for example, about pardoning Jack Johnson, who they going to pardon next? Emmett Till? Yeah. Who they going to pardon next? The 4 little girls who died in that church bombing? They're going to pardon Medgar Evers? We have to be smarter as a people and as a population, and not get caught up in this. So there are even some black people saying, well, I understand what the commissioner is saying. The protests have nothing to do with football. That's very shallow thinking.
No, well, you know what? I'm guilty of that to some degree because I've said that. Not that I accept it because I know that the president hijacked the issue and I'm disgusted by it. But my mentality is that the reality is that unfortunately he pulled it off. So I deferred. Yeah. Like yesterday, I deferred to an article that you wrote where you called on the players to think beyond the protest. And I'd like you to, because I was using that as, metaphorically speaking, I was just alluding to it to say, hey, he's right. And you have to think beyond the protest because the president already pulled off the heist of hijacking the issue and turning it into something that it absolutely was not about, which is patriotism. So Dr. Harry Edwards writing an article calling for the players to do something beyond protesting, to think beyond those specific protests is what I thought was a brilliant idea. Please explain that.
Well, this was prior to the league turning it into a football issue.
Right.
This was when it was an issue that targeted developments and issues beyond the arena. And so the fact that at that point that Trump had hijacked what was already a fading protest movement was irrelevant because Trump wouldn't have anything to point to except athletes out in the community, working with community leaders, getting police departments along with community activists and organizers and mayors and council people and pastors around the table to discuss the issue. If he wanted to point to that, then good. I'm glad because I want to see that publicized. But they would have taken away what it was that he was trying to dangle as a shining object in front of his base to show that he was still fighting the racist fight. So that was the article that I wrote was in reference to a point before the owners turned this into a football issue, an issue having to do with contradictions and conflicts within the arena between coaches and players, between owners and players, between different sectors of political disposition in the locker room among players. This is where this thing has broken south and to the right, and now we have to deal with that. Are the athletes settled enough, smart enough, intuitive enough at this point to say, okay, let's take it all off the table. We're not going to protest in the arena. We know that they have gotten the message. When Dr. Edwards goes and gives a lecture and asks how many people are uncomfortable or somewhat uncomfortable with the protest, 3/4 of the hands go up. And then he turns around and asks how many of you would trade places with African Americans. Not a single white hand goes up. That tells you they got the message. They know what's going on. So now the issue is, what are we going to do about it? Let's just take it all off the table.
Dr. Harry Edwards right here with Stephen A. on ESPN Radio. Before I let you go out, let me ask you this question. Do you think the media has an obligation to report on which players do not come out of the locker room for the anthem, considering what we're talking about here?
I don't know whether they have an obligation or not, but I know they're going to. They're going to have a list of the athletes who are not coming out. The camera's going to be on the athletes who run out of the locker room after the anthem. And if an athlete has a back injury or something like that he has to get massaged right up until the last moment so it doesn't stiffen up on him and he's a starter like a quarterback or a corner, all of a sudden the question is going to be, well, was he protesting or did he have an injury? Now the team has to come out and say, well, our starting quarterback has a back problem that we have to loosen up right up until the last minute. And the first time that gets out, the opposing team is going to say, hey, let's test that back. Let's hit him a couple of times right out the chute. So this thing is going to become complicated. I don't know whether the media has an obligation, but I know what they're going to do. And they're going to put a spotlight on the players who are running out.
And the thing that's bad about it, Doc, is that I'm looking at it from the perspective that, first of all, you're going to have a spotlight on those who are coming out, just like you just said. As a result, the issue is not going to fade away because you know it's not going to fade away because of that very, very reality. The animus from those who are opposed to these guys to begin with in the protest is going to grow. It's going to swell. And oh, by the way, I think it's going to cause division within the ranks because you're going to have players who stay behind. You're going to have other players who do go out for the national anthem, and they're not going to be on the same page. And who's to say how that's going to affect all of us? To that,
and you say what? You got to divide it. You got to divide it locker room. So at the end of the day, this is one that could have been avoided. You had a fading movement. All the league had to do was, hey, sometimes the best policy is no policy at all. Let's do nothing. Let's focus instead on moving from protests to policies, programs, and progress, and let this thing go away. And let's also send a letter to the Oval Office advising one specific person, let us run the NFL. You run the government, because given the job that you're doing, I don't know what you're doing watching football anyway. So, I mean, at the end of the day, there are all kinds of ways that this could have been handled. And it was not, and I lay that directly at the feet of the commissioner and the owners. It didn't have to become this chaotic or this bad.
I know you've dealt with a lot of frustrations, a lot of things that have disappointed you throughout the years, but considering your multiple decade relationship with the National Football League and what you've witnessed from these owners and this commissioner who you obviously respect and are fond of to some degree, where does that leave you, sir, in terms of, from an emotional perspective, from having to deal with these individuals moving forward, knowing that they'll reach out to you for counsel and beyond? Where does that leave you?
To be available, to continue to do the work that's necessary to clarify the issues and talk about the options and let it be known that this struggle is perpetual, that it's dynamic, and there are no final victories. We're going to have to figure out a way to manage this situation and come out of it better. And let me say one other thing.
Yes, sir.
We've gone through all of this as a society before. We've gone through much worse than what's going on in D.C. now. We went through a civil war and we came out of it better. We went through a bloody labor movement and we came out of it better. We went through a women's movement before and we came out of it better. We went through a civil rights movement that killed more people in this country by a factor of 3 than the 9/11 terrorist attack on the towers. And we came out of it better. We're going to come out of this better because that's what we, the people, do. We continue to struggle. We go back and pick up the pieces. We reorganize, and we come out of it better. We're going to come out of this better.
I would love to leave that to be the last word, but I'd be remiss in neglecting to ask you before I let you go. In light of the ruling, in light of what's coming down based off the mouth of the commissioner, should Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed have jobs in the NFL within the next week?
Well, it's gotten to the place now that they're martyrs. And it'd be like somebody asking, what difference would it make if they had given Rosa Parks her seat back? The thing had gotten so much bigger than that, it wasn't even. It's almost a laughable kind of gesture. But at the end of the day, of course, they should be working in the NFL if they have the capability of making a team. And what I've suggested is that all protesting athletes should be in camp when it opens. At the start of the preseason, whether or not they're on the regular season roster, that's a football issue, but they most certainly should be in camp. So, yeah, I hope that Eric Reed and Kaepernick are in camp in August. That would be a step in the right direction, but it's not going to resolve the issue.
And you said that if they're not there, you said the players should protest before a preseason game?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, should people in Montgomery, Alabama have protested because Rosa Parks didn't have her seat back? I mean, at some point, the issue is so much bigger than that. What the NFL has done is to open this up to a challenge involving fundamental basic principles of adhering to the collective bargaining agreement, freedom of speech, athletes' rights, and so forth and so on. It would be great, but I would not advocate that athletes protest for Cap and Eric to get their jobs back. That's a part of a much larger and more important issue concerning athletes' rights and so forth in the wake of this shoddy, cobbled together nonsense that was enunciated by the commissioner.
Dr. Harry, it was always an honor and privilege to have you on the show. You know that. Deeply appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend all of this time with me. Thank you so much, buddy. Have a great day.
Thank you. Keep the conversation going.
You know it.
That's just a sample of what you'll hear on the Stephen A. Smith Show. Weekdays at 1 p.m. Eastern on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app.